Every forecaster covering the United States this weekend is describing the exact same thing. And it is not a single storm, not a single heat wave, not a single flood risk. It is a forecast that gets measurably worse with almost every day you turn the calendar page, building across three completely different hazards in three completely different parts of the country at the same time. The National Weather Service's own Weather Prediction Center put it about as plainly as a federal forecasting agency ever puts anything, describing a multi-day heavy rainfall threat stretching from the Midwest into the Ohio Valley through the coming week, layered directly on top of a hazardous heat forecast gripping much of the south central and southeast United States all the way through next weekend. At the same moment, meteorologists at the National Hurricane Center are watching not one but two separate disturbances spinning off the coast of Africa, one of which now has roughly a 50% chance of organizing into this season's next named storm within days. None of these three threats are happening in isolation, and none of them are staying still. They are each independently intensifying day by day across a map that covers tens of millions of people. And today, we are going to walk through exactly how this week is expected to unfold, hazard by hazard, region by region, so you know precisely what is coming and when. Before we get into the day-by-day breakdown, stick around, because we are going to cover the flooding threat building across the nation's midsection, the heat dome that refuses to let go of Texas and the southeast, and the tropical system that could be forming in the Atlantic before the week is out. If a clear, no-nonsense breakdown like this is useful heading into your week, subscribing means you will not miss the updates as this situation develops, because virtually everything about this forecast is still moving. And if you are somewhere inside one of these threat zones right now, drop a comment and tell me what conditions look like on your end, because these on-the-ground updates genuinely help paint a fuller picture of how this week is actually playing out. Let's start where the week actually begins, because the opening days are deceptively calm compared to what builds later. Heading into Monday, a ridge of high pressure remains parked over the south-central United States, the same feature that has kept places like North Texas locked under excessive heat warnings for more than a week straight, with feels-like temperatures reaching as high as 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and grid operators at ERCOT, the entity managing Texas's power supply, extending their weather watch all the way out to August 18th, specifically because of the strain that sustained triple-digit heat places on electricity demand. Meanwhile, further north and east, a more unsettled pattern is already in motion. Isolated severe storms are expected across the plains and into the Midwest on Monday, with the primary hazards being gusty winds and large hail rather than anything more extreme. And forecasters are already flagging that this activity, while scattered and not affecting everyone, is really just the opening act for something considerably more organized arriving by midweek. Tuesday looks similar in character. Another day of isolated storms carrying the same gusty wind and large hail risk, still scattered enough that plenty of areas stay completely dry. But the pattern behind these storms is what meteorologists are actually watching closely, because it is the same broader atmospheric setup that is about to produce a genuinely serious multi-day flooding threat. That threat becomes the headline by Wednesday and really takes hold through Thursday and Friday. And it is worth understanding exactly why, because this is not simply more rain, it is a specific and dangerous meteorological pattern. According to the Weather Prediction Center's extended forecast discussion, a progressive and unsettled regime is expected to persist across the northern and eastern United States through at least the beginning of next weekend, while a separate ridge holds firm over the south-central states. Embedded within that northern unsettled flow is a shortwave, essentially a kink in the upper atmosphere's wind pattern, that is forecast to support repeated rounds of thunderstorms and showers across the northern tier of the country. The real danger comes from what happens when those storms slow down. Multiple days of slow-moving storms stacking up across portions of the Midwest and the Ohio Valley create exactly the conditions that lead to flooding. Not because any single storm is unusually intense, but because storm after storm tracks over the same stretch of ground before the previous round of rain has had any chance to drain away. Meteorologists sometimes call this training like individual boxcars of a train passing over the same section of track one after another, and it is one of the most reliable recipes for dangerous flash flooding in the entire playbook of severe weather, because the total rainfall accumulating in one location over 48 to 72 hours can end up far higher than what any single storm report would suggest. By Thursday, this rainfall threat is expected to be in full swing across the Midwest and into the Ohio Valley, and forecasters are explicitly warning that this is a multi-day threat rather than a single afternoon of storms, meaning the flood risk compounds with each additional round of rain rather than resetting overnight. That threat becomes the headline by Wednesday and really takes hold through Thursday and Friday. And it is worth understanding exactly why, because this is not simply more rain, it is a specific and dangerous meteorological pattern. According to the Weather Prediction Center's extended forecast discussion, a progressive and unsettled regime is expected to persist across the northern and eastern United States through at least the beginning of next weekend, while a separate ridge holds firm over the south central states. Embedded within that northern unsettled flow is a shortwave, essentially a kink in the upper atmosphere's wind pattern, that is forecast to support repeated rounds of thunderstorms and showers across the northern tier of the country. The real danger comes from what happens when those storms slow down. Multiple days of slow-moving storms stacking up across portions of the Midwest and the Ohio Valley create exactly the conditions that lead to flooding, not because any single storm is unusually intense, but because storm after storm tracks over the same stretch of ground before the previous round of rain has had any chance to drain away. Meteorologists sometimes call this training like individual boxcars of a train passing over the same section of track one after another, and it is one of the most reliable recipes for dangerous flash flooding in the entire playbook of severe weather, because the total rainfall accumulating in one location over 48 to 72 hours can end up far higher than what any single storm report would suggest. By Thursday, this rainfall threat is expected to be in full swing across the Midwest and into the Ohio Valley, and forecasters are explicitly warning that this is a multi-day threat rather than a single afternoon of storms, meaning the flood risk compounds with each additional round of rain rather than resetting overnight. Beyond the immediate flash flooding danger, there is a secondary risk that tends to get less attention but matters just as much for anyone in the path of this pattern, and that is river flooding building over a slightly longer time frame. Flash flooding happens fast, often within an hour or two of heavy rain falling in a specific spot, and it is driven almost entirely by how quickly water runs off the immediate landscape. River flooding works differently, accumulating gradually as rainfall from an entire watershed, sometimes covering hundreds of square miles, drains into the same streams and tributaries over the following days. When a pattern like this one produces multiple consecutive days of heavy rain across the same general region, both hazards tend to show up together, an immediate flash flood risk during and right after each individual round of storms, followed by a slower building river flood risk that can persist for days after the rain itself has actually stopped. That lag is part of why flood warnings sometimes remain in effect even once the sky is cleared and the sun is out, because the water working its way downstream through the watershed hasn't caught up with the rainfall that produced it yet. While that flooding threat builds in the nation's midsection, the heat dome sitting over the south central and southeast United States is not going anywhere. And if anything, the Weather Prediction Center's own language describes it intensifying through the back half of the week and holding on through the following weekend. To understand why this particular heat has been so stubborn, it helps to understand what a heat dome actually is mechanically. It forms when a large area of high pressure aloft essentially traps air underneath it like an invisible lid, and the air trapped inside that lid sinks, compresses, and warms further as it descends, while the high pressure simultaneously blocks the kind of cloud formation and rainfall that would normally interrupt the heating cycle. Texas has been sitting underneath almost exactly this setup for more than 2 weeks now, with the ridge occasionally wobbling west toward Arizona and Nevada before swinging back east and re-strengthening over the Lone Star State, a pattern that has produced consecutive days of triple-digit heat, feels like readings well above what the thermometer alone would suggest, and warm, muggy overnight lows that never let the ground fully cool before the next day's heating begins all over again. As this pattern holds through the coming week, that same ridge is expected to keep hazardous heat locked in place, not just over Texas, but expanding its reach across much of the south central region and into the southeast, meaning millions of additional people across states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia are looking at a stretch of dangerously hot conditions running essentially uninterrupted through the coming weekend. There is a genuinely important physiological reason this kind of heat is more dangerous than a simple high temperature reading conveys, and it comes down to humidity. When you combine extreme heat with the kind of moisture-rich air typical of the south central and southeast United States in August, the human body's primary cooling mechanism, sweat evaporating off the skin, becomes significantly less effective because the surrounding air is already close to saturated and simply cannot absorb much additional moisture. That is precisely why feels-like temperatures during this stretch have been running as much as 10 to 15 degrees above the actual air temperature. And it is also why overnight low temperatures matter just as much as the daytime highs. When nighttime temperatures fail to drop meaningfully, the human body loses its normal recovery window, the period where core temperature is supposed to fall, heart rate is supposed to normalize, and the cumulative stress of a hot day is supposed to reset before the next one begins. Across large stretches of Texas and the southeast this week, overnight lows are expected to stay in the upper 70s to low 80s, conditions that offer essentially no meaningful relief before the heating cycle starts again the following morning. The strain this kind of sustained heat places on infrastructure deserves its own attention, because it is easy to focus purely on how the weather feels outside and overlook what it does to the systems everyone depends on indoors. ERCOT's decision to extend its weather watch across Texas all the way through August 18th reflects a genuine operational concern, not a routine bulletin. When tens of millions of air conditioning units are running at or near maximum capacity simultaneously across a state for more than 2 consecutive weeks, electricity demand climbs toward the upper edges of what the grid was built to handle, and grid operators have to actively monitor power reserves rather than simply assuming supply will keep pace with demand automatically. Grid conditions across Texas have so far remained normal through this stretch, but the fact that a formal extended watch was necessary at all illustrates how a heat dome holding in place for weeks, rather than days, becomes a genuinely different kind of hazard than a single hot weekend, one that tests not just individual health and hydration, but the physical infrastructure an entire region relies on to stay safe through it. Now layer the third piece onto the same week, because while the middle of the country deals with a compounding flood threat and the South bakes under a stubborn heat dome, the tropical Atlantic is waking up for the first time in weeks. The National Hurricane Center has been tracking multiple disturbances off the west coast of Africa, and as of this weekend, forecasters have narrowed their attention to 2 specific areas of interest. The first is a broad area of showers and thunderstorms located several hundred miles southwest of the Cabo Verde Islands, which has roughly a 20% chance of organizing over the coming week as it tracks west through the central Atlantic, though forecasters expect increasing upper-level wind shear to make conditions progressively less favorable for development as it nears the Lesser Antilles later in the week. The second system is the one drawing considerably more attention. A small area of low pressure has formed south of the Cabo Verde Islands and is expected to merge with another tropical wave in the coming days. And as that merger plays out, the National Hurricane Center has assigned it roughly a 50% chance of becoming a tropical depression or tropical storm within the next 7 days. If it organizes into a named system, it would become Cristobal, the next name on this year's Atlantic hurricane season list. It is genuinely too early to know whether this system will ultimately threaten the United States. And forecasters are explicit that both disturbances currently pose no immediate threat to Florida or the Gulf Coast, but the fact that the Atlantic is producing serious development candidates again after a quiet stretch is itself meaningful, because it signals the basin may be shifting into a more active phase just as peak hurricane season approaches. The reason this year's tropical activity has been comparatively muted up to this point, and the reason forecasters are watching these new disturbances with some genuine uncertainty about whether they will actually develop, comes back to the same atmospheric driver sitting behind nearly every major weather story of 2026, an unusually powerful El Niño building across the Pacific. NOAA's updated Atlantic hurricane outlook this year specifically cited this looming super El Niño as a factor expected to help limit overall storm activity, because El Niño tends to increase upper-level wind shear across the Atlantic basin, and wind shear is essentially poison for a developing tropical system, tearing apart the vertical structure a storm needs to organize and intensify before it ever gets the chance to strengthen. That is exactly the obstacle both of this week's Atlantic disturbances are forecast to run into as they track westward, encountering areas of dry air and stronger shear that could weaken or completely halt their development, even if they manage to organize briefly. This is also, worth noting, the same El Niño event that has been driving the extraordinary heat records set across East Asia in recent weeks, and the stubborn heat dome sitting over Texas and the southeast right now. Because an unusually powerful El Niño doesn't just affect one region or one type of weather, it reshapes atmospheric circulation patterns across the entire planet simultaneously, suppressing tropical storm formation in the Atlantic, while simultaneously helping lock heat domes in place over land masses thousands of miles away. The reason this year's tropical activity has been comparatively muted up to this point, and the reason forecasters are watching these new disturbances with some genuine uncertainty about whether they will actually develop, comes back to the same atmospheric driver sitting behind nearly every major weather story of 2026, an unusually powerful El Niño building across the Pacific. NOAA's updated Atlantic hurricane outlook this year specifically cited this looming super El Niño as a factor expected to help limit overall storm activity, because El Niño tends to increase upper-level wind shear across the Atlantic basin. And wind shear is essentially poison for a developing tropical system, tearing apart the vertical structure a storm needs to organize and intensify before it ever gets the chance to strengthen. That is exactly the obstacle both of this week's Atlantic disturbances are forecast to run into as they track westward, encountering areas of dry air and stronger shear that could weaken or completely halt their development even if they manage to organize briefly. This is also, worth noting, the same El Niño event that has been driving the extraordinary heat records set across East Asia in recent weeks, and the stubborn heat dome sitting over Texas and the southeast right now, because an unusually powerful El Niño doesn't just affect one region or one type of weather, it reshapes atmospheric circulation patterns across the entire planet simultaneously, suppressing tropical storm formation in the Atlantic, while simultaneously helping lock heat domes in place over land masses thousands of miles away. It genuinely helps to see this week's U.S. pattern next to what has been happening elsewhere on the planet under the exact same global setup, because it shows this is not a uniquely American phenomenon, but one expression of a single, unusually powerful climate driver playing out differently depending on the geography underneath it. Across the Korean peninsula in recent days, a stalled dome of high pressure produced the single highest temperature ever officially recorded in South Korean history, while heatstroke alerts spread across roughly 2/3 of Japan's prefectures under that same broader pattern. In inland China, weather stations recorded readings past 46 degrees Celsius during the most intense stretch of their own heat wave earlier this summer. Every one of those events traces back to the same combination now sitting over the American South, a stalled ridge of high pressure reinforced by unusually warm ocean temperatures, tied to this year's El Niño, simply relocated to a different continent with different terrain underneath it. See next to that global picture, the heat dome parked over Texas and expanding into the southeast this week is not an isolated American weather story. It is the same mechanism that just set an all-time national temperature record on the other side of the planet, now doing its version of the same thing here. Put all three of these pieces together, and you get the actual shape of what this week looks like on the ground for tens of millions of people, and it is genuinely useful to walk through it region by region, rather than treating it as one abstract national forecast. Across Texas, Louisiana, and much of the Gulf Coast, the story is continuity rather than sudden change. Another stretch of dangerously hot, humid days with little to no rainfall relief, excessive heat warnings likely remaining in effect or being reissued as the week progresses, an elevated strain on electrical grids as air conditioning demand stays high through peak afternoon hours. Across the broader southeast, that same hazardous heat expands its reach as the week goes on, meaning states that have so far avoided the worst of what Texas has experienced should expect conditions to deteriorate rather than improve as the ridge strengthens and broadens its footprint. Across the Midwest and into the Ohio Valley, the story flips entirely. A transition from scattered garden-variety severe storms early in the week into a genuinely serious multi-day flash flooding threat by Thursday and Friday, driven by repeated rounds of slow-moving thunderstorms training over the same areas. And across the far northern tier of the country, an unsettled, progressive weather pattern continues to bring showers and thunderstorm chances through the period, adding yet another layer of complexity for anyone trying to plan outdoor activities or travel across that stretch of the map. Meanwhile, out over the open Atlantic, a storm system that does not yet exist could very plausibly acquire a name by the end of the week, adding a fourth, still uncertain variable to a forecast that already has 3 confirmed, actively worsening hazards layered on top of each other. It is worth being honest about why weeks like this one keep happening with what feels like increasing frequency, because none of these 3 hazards are occurring in a vacuum disconnected from the broader climate picture. The same jet stream mechanics that have been producing record-breaking, multi-week heat domes across multiple continents this year, a slower, wavier upper-level wind pattern caused in part by the Arctic warming roughly 4 times faster than the global average, are the exact mechanics keeping this week's heat dome locked over the south-central United States, rather than allowing it to break down and move through the way high-pressure systems used to more reliably do. And a warmer atmosphere is also quite simply a wetter one when conditions do turn unsettled, because warmer air holds measurably more water vapor, meaning that when storm systems do organize and track over the same stretch of the Midwest repeatedly, the total rainfall they are capable of producing in a 48 to 72-hour window tends to run higher than it would have a few decades ago under an equivalent weather pattern. None of this means every single week is going to look like this one specifically. Weather remains variable, and this particular combination of a stalled southern ridge, an active northern storm track, and a reawakening Atlantic is a specific, somewhat unusual alignment rather than a permanent state. But it does mean the baseline conditions this week is building from warmer oceans, a more energetic atmosphere, and a jet stream more prone to getting stuck in place, are themselves part of a longer trend rather than a one-off anomaly, which is exactly why meteorologists keep describing events like this one as consistent with, rather than separate from, the broader pattern shaping recent years. So here is what actually matters heading into the days ahead, broken down by the specific hazard you are most likely to encounter depending on where you live. If you are anywhere under the south central or southeast heat dome, the guidance is the same guidance that has applied for the past 2 weeks and will keep applying through the coming weekend. Limit outdoor activity and strenuous physical work to the early morning or evening hours whenever possible. Drink water consistently throughout the day rather than waiting until you feel thirsty. Check on elderly relatives, neighbors, or anyone without reliable access to air conditioning, and take note that overnight temperatures failing to drop meaningfully means your body is not getting the recovery window it needs, which makes cumulative heat exposure across several consecutive days more dangerous than a single hot afternoon would be on its own. Watch for the warning signs of heat-related illness specifically: dizziness, confusion, a rapid pulse, and hot, dry, or unusually flushed skin are all signals that require immediate attention rather than a wait-and-see approach. If you are anywhere in the path of the developing flood threat across the Midwest or Ohio Valley, the guidance shifts entirely toward water safety. Never attempt to drive through a flooded roadway, since it takes surprisingly little moving water, often as little as 12 inches, to sweep a vehicle off the road entirely. And remember that flash flooding, by definition, develops quickly, sometimes within minutes of heavy rain beginning in a given area, which means waiting to see how bad it gets before taking action can itself become the dangerous decision. Keep an eye on National Weather Service alerts for your specific county rather than relying on a general regional forecast, since flash flood warnings are issued at a hyperlocal level precisely because rainfall totals and runoff conditions can vary dramatically even within a single metropolitan area. And if you are anywhere along the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic seaboard, even though neither of this week's tropical disturbances currently threatens the United States directly, this is genuinely the right moment to review your hurricane preparedness plan rather than waiting for an actual storm to be bearing down on your coastline. Since peak hurricane season is still ahead, and the Atlantic showing renewed signs of activity after a quiet stretch is exactly the kind of signal that tends to precede a more active run of storm formation later in August and into September. There's also a broader lesson embedded in a week shaped like this one, which is that modern, severe weather forecasting increasingly requires thinking in terms of compounding simultaneous hazards rather than a single storm or a single heat wave in isolation. A decade or two ago, a forecast description like the one issued by the Weather Prediction Center this weekend, naming a multi-day flood threat in one region and a hazardous heat threat in another within the same discussion, would have been somewhat unusual. It is becoming considerably more routine now, and emergency management officials across multiple states have begun explicitly training for exactly this kind of scenario. Where resources meant to respond to flooding in one part of a state might be needed at the same moment cooling centers are being stood up in another part of that same state, stretching response capacity in ways that planning built around single, isolated hazards was never really designed to handle. That reality does not mean any individual person needs to panic about this particular week specifically. It does mean that paying attention to the full shape of a forecast, not just the temperature or just the rain chance for your own backyard, but the broader pattern connecting heat, flooding, and tropical development happening simultaneously across the country, is genuinely useful information rather than an overreaction to ordinary summer weather. Step back and look at the complete shape of what this week actually represents. A ridge of high pressure that has already kept Texas under excessive heat warnings for more than 2 weeks is holding firm and expanding its reach into the southeast rather than breaking down. A separate atmospheric pattern to the north is set to produce repeated rounds of slow-moving thunderstorms across the Midwest and Ohio Valley, threatening the kind of compounding flash flooding that comes not from any single dramatic storm, but from days of rain stacking on top of days of rain. And out over the Atlantic, after weeks of relative quiet, 2 separate disturbances are showing real signs of organizing, with one carrying roughly even odds of becoming this season's next named storm before the week is out. None of these 3 hazards are waiting for the others to finish before beginning. They are unfolding on top of each other across the same 7-day stretch, which is exactly why so many forecasters this weekend reached for some version of the same description. A forecast that does not improve as the week goes on, but rather compounds, hazard by hazard, day by day. We will be tracking every piece of this as it develops: the flood threat, the heat dome's staying power, and whether that Atlantic disturbance actually earns a name. So if you want to see how this plays out in real time, subscribing is the easiest way to catch each update as it happens. Before you go, drop a comment and let me know which of these 3 threats is most relevant to where you live right now and how you're planning to handle it. Thanks so much for watching all the way through, and we will see you in the next one.